Thank you for joining in on this virtual field day series. I'm Guy Collins. We hate we can't be with you in person today, but I do wanted to show you some of the field work that we're doing all across North Carolina this year and last year that myself and Dr. Keith Edmiston are conducting in collaboration with Dr. Jason Ward in Ag Engineering and his graduate student Enrique Pena Martinez. And this has to do with redefining our replanting recommendations for cotton in North Carolina. So replanting in North Carolina sadly is not uncommon. It can be influenced by a large number of things, primarily weather. That comes to no surprise. In North Carolina, our planting season tends to be fairly challenging, whether that's prolonged spells of cool temperatures in the early spring or heavy packing rains that may influence emergence. Those are the most common factors. And they vary from year to year and even within a season. Now, over the past 2 years, we've seen quite a bit of difference in this weather behavior. 2019, for example, we had excellent planting conditions starting in very early May, which lasted most of our normal planting window with the exception of a few dry periods. In 2020, however, it was quite a bit different story. We started cold and wet, and we stayed that way essentially the entire planting season with the exception of a 5-day period right in the middle of May. But even once we got to acceptable temperatures, we had weeks even of heavy packing rains that negatively influenced emergence through most of our planting season. So in addition to that, there are some other factors that do play a role in the necessity for replanting and achieving an optimal stand. One is seed size. A lot of our current varieties vary fairly widely in terms of seed size, and a lot of our past research suggests that seed size is highly correlated to seedling vigor as long as warm and cool germ are at acceptable levels. Which brings me to my next point, seed quality. That's been a big issue over the past couple of years. Most of you are aware of that. I do want to remind you about the pilot program that NCDA has started back in 2020. This is a very successful program. We strongly encourage all producers to be checking their seed quality in that program and notifying NCDA if they don't see their lot number listed in that program, and an inspector will come out and collect a sample per their protocol. But seed quality strongly affects the necessity for replanting in successful stands. Seeding rates, and what I mean by this is the growers that tend to skimp on their seeding rates a little bit, trying to save a little money and push these seeding rates as low as they possibly can, oftentimes may encounter a replanting scenario a little more frequently than somebody that pays attention a little closer to the seeding rate and tries to plant an optimal rate for higher yields. Now that does come into play with seed size and weather conditions as well. So naturally a smaller seeded variety, we want to make sure we're planting that in warmer conditions and maybe plant it a little shallower. For example, larger seeded varieties we could get by with a little bit lower seeding rate, and especially if it has a higher cool germ rating, we can feel a little bit better about planting those in somewhat marginal or adequate conditions. The time that we have to plant or replant, that does play a role. Our planting season in North Carolina is fairly narrow. Generally we start somewhere around the end of April, and that goes to the end of May, sometimes into the first week of June. But compared to other states, our window is fairly small. And the size and acreage of most of our growers now, we're forced to plant through some of these periods that may not be ideal for cotton planting. So that may just by default force us to plant in a scenario where we're more likely than not to have to replant. Now currently Our recommendations are based off of some previous research conducted back in the early 2000s in Georgia and in Louisiana by some former cotton specialists there. And they developed a decision aid, and generally speaking, they concluded that 50% of the planted area occupied by 3-foot skips or greater at that point can generally necessitate replanting. So that's where our current recommendations are based on, and we want to evaluate that because there's been a lot of different changes that have occurred since this work has been done. One is changes in seed size. Modern varieties differ fairly widely in terms of seed size, but we have seen a trend where seed tend to appear to be getting a little bit smaller, especially in some of our more popular varieties. Yield potential has changed, which is a good thing. Yield potential tends to increase over time as new variety advancements are commercialized and new varieties come onto the market. Naturally, that plays into the equation in terms of cost of replanting and the rewards for doing so. The big change has occurred over the last 5 to 6 years. Used to, it would cost us really fuel and labor and wear and tear on equipment to plant or replant cotton. Prior to 5 or 6 years ago, most seed companies would just provide you with extra seed if you needed to replant. That changed a few years ago. Now most companies charge 25% of SRP, which is suggested retail price, and you add that to labor and fuel and wear and tear on equipment. This was surveyed to a few of our prominent growers. On average, that could cost you somewhere in the ballpark now of $35 an acre to replant cotton, which is quite expensive. So when you plug that into the equation, that really changes things. So we wanted to reevaluate our replanting recommendations for all of these reasons. So given all of these scenarios and what we commonly experience in North Carolina, skippy stands are not necessarily uncommon. It does vary from year to year and even within a season, and some other things like soil type do influence how frequently we encounter a skippy stand and whether or not we need to replant. A lot of these replanting decisions are really based on visual estimations of plant stands and therefore the skips within that plant stand. Really the only way to accurately assess a plant stand and therefore the size and frequency of these skips are through manual measurements, which are oftentimes very tedious. Most folks don't take the time to really do it because it takes quite a bit of time to accurately do it. So this is why we teamed up with Dr. Ward and his graduate student. These drones or UAVs offer a great opportunity for us to assess this with overhead imagery, so maybe we could do this in a much more timely manner. They are probably going to talk about that in another talk, so we're not going to dive too much into that for right now. We want to illustrate exactly what we're doing and why in this presentation here. But we do oftentimes notice two types of error when it comes to replanting amongst most growers. Naturally, those are the ones that replant when it's probably not necessary, and other growers may not replant when it probably is justified. So there are mistakes on both sides of this to be made, simply due to poor visual estimations on whether or not they need to replant. So as we mentioned earlier, cotton planting in North Carolina typically begins somewhere in late April or early May. Our first insurance cutoff is May 25th, and our final insurance cutoff is at the end of May. Beyond that, there is no insurance coverage. We have seen some cotton planted in that first week or so of June. Most of the time, it's generally accepted that cotton planted on or before May 25th should have about an equal chance to perform as good as cotton planted in late April or early May. Additionally, cotton planted between May 25th and on into the first week of June becomes a little more risky, a lot more erratic, but oftentimes if a grower is a very timely manager and can be very timely with their inputs, especially insect sprays for like thrips and plant bugs and bollworms, stink bugs, etc., they can oftentimes pull it off. Maybe not with ideal yields or equal yields to that of early planted cotton, but somewhere within 80+% of that yield of early planted cotton. Now in some years your late planted cotton may yield greater than your early planted cotton. This could be the result of several reasons, primarily hurricanes or some kind of wet weather that occurs in September that causes a lot of hard lock and boll rot on early planted cotton, but late planted cotton may be unaffected because those bolls remain closed and protected, whereas a hurricane could knock out some lint from early planted cotton, for example. However, in other years, like what we saw in 2019, just seasonal rainfall and or drought can reward early planted cotton over late planted cotton. So we see that oftentimes too. So in this scenario, in our current research, we have both early and late planted trials. In the early planted trials, our treatments were planted right around the 1st of May, generally between April 29th and May 5th. And a replant treatment was planted on May 25th to simulate when, right before we would encounter our first insurance cutoff. Then we have our late planted trials where most of our treatments were planted right around our first insurance cutoff, so right around May 25th, with our replant treatment occurring on June the 5th, so right at the end of that first week of June. Alright, so this is our 100% stand. Very loosely speaking, we generally advise somewhere around 500 seed per acre. This is 3 seed per foot on 36-inch rows, and this is a 100% stand. From there, which we mix seed, transgenic seed with conventional seed at various ratios. This is 75%. And then with 3 weeks in a row, we go in and apply Roundup and Liberty and to kill out the conventional plants. And what we're trying to simulate here is, or trying to create, is natural random skips in terms of size and frequency. Okay, similar to what you would encounter in a real world situation. So you want to focus on the blue seed here. Those are the ones that we want to keep and the ones that we want to emerge. So this is a 75% stand. Now we have a 50% stand and a 25% stand. You can see we're getting fairly thin here. And then lastly, a 10% stand. Okay, so naturally this would be a replant scenario in most cases. Alright, so you heard me mention our collaboration with Dr. Jason Ward and his graduate student Enrique Martinez. So they were kind enough to collaborate with us and take some overhead imagery using UAVs. I'm not going to get too much into that because they're probably going to talk about that in a separate presentation. But this is just an overhead shot of some of these treatments. This is your 100% stand that we have highlighted here. Then your 75% stand. Now your 50% stand. Then your 25% stand. You can see fairly is thin, and we have a fairly high frequency of 3-foot skips or greater. And then you have your replant treatments, which is naturally younger cotton. So remember, the early planted trials were planted in early April and replanted on May 25th. Your late planted trials, they were planted around May 25th with a replant treatment around June the 5th. And that matches closely what we see growers doing across the state. And by the way, this research was conducted all across the coastal plains in Rocky Mount, Lewiston, and then down in the Blacklands at Plymouth. So what our ag engineers did was take these aerial images and correlated this to a map of plants, and this way they could create an algorithm where they map a reference plant, and then they could count or measure the distance to adjacent plants within that row all the way through to the end of the plot. So we're measuring the entire area versus just a sample area, and the accurate measurement of those size and frequency of skips in all of these different treatments. So set that aside. We wanted to use this as a training exercise. So what I want you to do here is just take a minute and see if you can guess the percent of the planted area occupied by 3-foot skips or greater. Now just focus at the bottom of the picture that you see here up to the green line. Just that area and just those middle 2 rows. That's the only area you need to evaluate. So keep in mind, just for example, if you have 10 feet of row and there are 5 continuous feet of skipped area, then the percent of planted area occupied by 3-foot skips or greater would be 50%. So you only want to focus on skips that are 3 foot or greater. Okay? In that same scenario, if you have 10 feet of row and there's only 2 feet of skipped area in that 10 feet of row, then you would completely ignore that because that's less than 3 feet. So that would be 0. So you only want to make sure you're counting or considering 3-foot skips or greater. So take a minute and see if you can guesstimate what the percent of the planted area is occupied by 3-foot skips or greater. Alright, so about 20 of our local cotton experts participated in this exercise in the field, and they estimated the percent of planted area occupied by 3-foot skips or greater to be anywhere from 60 to 95%, so fairly wide range that you see there, and average across all of those experts was 78%. So the actual measured area was 89%. So you can see there's some variance there from actual manual measurements versus visual estimations, even amongst our experts that you can see. Alright, another scenario. See if you can take a minute in this plot, guess the percent of the planted area occupied by 3-foot skips or greater. Now again, ignore any skips that are less than 3 feet in size. Only consider those that are 3 foot or greater. So our experts in this scenario, we see a little bit wider range here. They guessed anywhere from 30 to 80% occupied by 3-foot skips or more, with an average of 59%. And the actual measurements here were 71% occupied by 3-foot skips or more. So a little more deviation between visual estimations and manual measurements. Alright, so completely change your mindset here. Ignore the 3-foot skips. We want you here to guesstimate the percent stand. Okay? Keep in mind this was planted at 43,500 seed per acre. That's 3 seed per foot on 36-inch rows. And the reason we're asking you this is we get these questions all the time. What percent stand can we live with? So I want to just take a second and see if you can guess what the percent stand is, keeping in mind that this was planted at 3 seed per foot on 36-inch rows. Alright, so this plot looks pretty good. Alright, our experts estimated this plot, or these 2 rows, to be anywhere from 70 to a 95% stand, with an average across all those sampled to be 85%. The actual stand here is a 50% stand. Alright, the reason we wanted to show you this is it's a little bit misleading. Alright, so this was that 50-50 mixture that we applied, and we essentially killed every other plant with herbicides. Those were conventional seed. Alright, so the plants that are survived, as you can see in this photo, are fairly equidistantly spaced. And especially for early planted cotton, keep in mind that cotton can compensate for small skips especially. And if they're equidistantly spaced, that's not necessarily a big deal. So when we get that question on what percent stand can we live with, we really need to reframe that and focus on the size and frequency of skips and go back to focusing on 3-foot skips or greater, not necessarily a percent stand. Alright, so just some yield results from last year, and I don't want to pretend that this was the case for all trials and all locations, but this is just one example from the early planted trials from 2019. Alright, so we really didn't see a major yield loss until we got down to 25% stand. But our replanted treatment, now keep in mind, this is early planted cotton, planted end of April, early May, with our replant treatment on May 25th, and that's in most situations that has an equal chance of performing as well as early May planted cotton. It's not always the case, depending on rainfall and other factors, but just based on average heat unit accumulation, this should be the case. So you can see acceptable yields with the replant treatment there on May 25th compared to early May planted cotton, especially our 175% stand. But we did lose yield at a 25% stand, which we'll talk a little bit about that later. That's the one that had the most 3-foot skips or greater. That's the point where we noticed most of those skips occurring. Now, in a late planted scenario, we started seeing a little bit different behavior where even the 50, sometimes the 75% stand yield a little bit less than the 100% stand. So we're starting to see a little bit of effect on yield when we get to some of these treatments without a major stand loss. So it's not always the case, it depending on the environment, but we do see this trend where especially the 50% treatment was a little more commonly associated with a yield reduction. And we also noted that the replanted treatment, now keep in mind that the replant treatment was on June the 5th compared to these other treatments which were planted on May 25th, which is our last insurance cutoff, or our first insurance cutoff rather. So this is the $1,000,000 question. This is always going to be the wild card in two different ways. One, will your replanted cotton achieve a good stand or an acceptable stand? Alright, and we rarely know that because you don't know if you're going to get a packing rain. Now, we can usually answer the question if it's related to temperatures. So if warmer temperatures are in the forecast this time, then yes, we're more likely to get a better stand. But if you get a heavy packing rain, especially if you have soils that tend to crust, you may not get a good stand with the second go round. And secondly is, will the year reward late planted cotton or replanted cotton? And we don't know that either. So we're always in that dilemma with early or late planted cotton, which will the year reward? And that becomes more important when we get into late May or even June, which is the scenario in this case. How well will it do? And a lot of times it comes down to if we have a tropical storm or hurricane that negatively influences earlier planted cotton, whereas late planted cotton may be protected. So last year, for example, our later planted treatments did not perform as well, even compared to our treatments that had significant stand loss. But in a hurricane year, that may be quite different. So we don't quite yet want to redraft our recommendations. Last year was a very unique year. We kind of want to look at this in several more environments, but this is a scenario here where on your y-axis you can see the percent of replanted yield. So 1 being equal to 100% of replanted yield. Anything less than that was lower yielding, and anything greater than that is higher yielding. And we have a regression line here correlated to percent of planted area, in this case occupied with skips greater than 3.5 feet. And so we're correlating those two, and we're drawing our regression line here to where it matches the point or meets the point where the cost of replanting is equal to that yield. So if you take $35 an acre as your replanting cost, and that was based on a survey of several growers, and you assume cotton prices of 70 cents, so we're lower than that currently. So if you do the math on that, it would take a yield loss of 50 pounds per acre to be a threshold at which the yield loss exceeds the cost of replanting. So anything greater than a 50-pound loss would exceed the cost of replanting. So if that's the case, and it's like that way every year in every scenario, if you draw this little line down to your x-axis, that would say that 7% of your area, planted area, occupied by, in this case, 3.5-foot skips, that would be the point in which you need to replant. So that's quite a bit different than our current recommendations. But again, this is one scenario done in 1 year. We're looking at several different environments in several different years before we redraft our recommendations. So we don't want to change any of that yet, or any of our practices just yet. But we found this to be fairly interesting. We do want to remind everybody about our planting conditions calculator. I'll show you how to find that in just a second. But it's very easy to use. You just pull up this map of North Carolina. You can actually zoom in to a particular farm or field if you want to. Click on a place on that map and click on Submit. That's all you have to do. We have a lot more growers using it now, especially this year that we had challenging planting conditions throughout most of our planting window. And at any given time, it's going to give you a 2 to 3 day forecast. Now keep in mind, for each of those days that it lists, there's actually a 5-day DD60 predicted forecast for each of those days. And it's going to rate that 5-day forecast from very good down to very poor. So in certain scenarios, it's going to trigger a warning. That, for example, if you have a nighttime that's going to drop below 50 degrees within those first 2 nights of planting, it's going to trigger a warning there telling you to be careful. Anytime it's rated as adequate or marginal, it's going to tell you to consider waiting on better conditions, or switch to larger seeded varieties with a higher cool germ. That's where it pays to look in the NCDA database. Plant a little bit shallower, or hill drop, so on and so forth. It even has a rainfall warning. If there's a 30% chance of getting an inch of rain or more, it's going to trigger a warning. So you can hopefully avoid packing rains, although they're difficult to forecast at times. So a lot of this you can find on our Cotton Portal website. All of us on the Extension Cotton team post things on this website. There's a lot of good resources on that website. You can find it right there at the top. That's cotton.ces.ncsu.edu. You can email me. That's my email address there at the top if you want to be added to our newsletter list. We post a lot of newsletters in any given year. And then below that are links that you can find on the Cotton Portal website. But we have one there for the variety calculator, planting conditions calculator, the new NCDA seed quality database that we really are encouraging everybody to use. Our entomologists have the thrips infestation predictor. The economists have our crop comparison tool, and our weed scientists have developed a spray conditions tool, especially for those auxin herbicides. There's our Facebook page and all of our Twitter handles for all of us on the cotton team. So we encourage you to follow us and reach out to us and your county agents anytime that we can help you. So thank you. Hopefully we'll see you in person very soon.